In this Photoshop tutorial, we're going to cover off the following topics. We first of all need to find some reference images that we're going to utilize for the look and feel of the renders that we're trying to produce. We'll then open up Photoshop and open up our raw renders and crop and clean them. We'll then have to paint in the composition that we're after, whether that be vegetation, people, lighting directions, and whatnot. We'll then go through color correction and different aligning our values of the raw render itself before we bring any other external elements in. We'll then go source the blocks to import. So this will include skies, people, clouds, vegetation, anything else that you want to add in. We'll then have to clean and mask those blocks as well as give them the correct values and color corrections so they sit inside of the render nice and in a balanced fashion. And then we'll go through the master brushes component. So master brushes over the top of basically everything will include shadows, lighting, both electrical lighting and natural lighting, dodging and burning of textures and blocks, or perhaps of the raw render, adding in fog and mist, and then as well as brushing in grass and foliage and any other entourage that we require. We'll then follow up with adding in clouds, and we can brush in clouds with some of the brush packs we're going to use, and that will then complete the render in post-production, which will then allow us to do the final step, which is probably the quickest component, which is to then put these on a title block for final export. Before beginning our post-production work in Photoshop, we need to essentially ascertain what our goal of this workflow actually is. Otherwise, we could just be essentially editing images just for the sake of editing, without any actual clear, concise goal. So personally, I think it's always a good idea to start with some references, even if they be references of like work. Usually it's good to have references of either professional work or of actual real-life photography. But in this scenario, just for brevity, we'll reference the finished example. So we can see here on the screen that this is the sectional view from my Rhino file at the end of it, the render at the end. And this is after post-production work. And we started with an image that looked like this. Or in fact, we're going to utilize the PNG file that looked like this. And through all those workflows that I mentioned previously, we end up with an image that looks like this. Now, some components I'm going to go through here in the sectional render, and then other components, just let me switch this up, I'm going to go through with the external render, just because there are certain workflows that, well, the workflows vary just slightly depending on whether we're doing an external or internal shot. In actual fact, I do think the externals are slightly easier because the building is further away. There's a little bit more room for error in terms of how clean your photoshopping has to be compared to the interiors, which just because of the sheer nature that you're much closer to the finished model, you've got to be a lot more precise with your Photoshop work. So if we take a look then at, so this is a finished example of one of the assignment. Let's take a look at some professional examples. So I keep arcing back to these guys, but I think in terms of matte painting rendering, there's no studio better in the world, in my opinion, than Arc9 Studios. So you can see here, this is on their website. This is just a blank raw render that's come out of probably something like 3ds Max, or to be honest, that could come straight out of Revit even. It's a very low quality white foam render essentially, but with the amount of Photoshop work, you can see how much they've added. I mean, it's basically 99% of the render is in post-prod. And, we don't have to get to this point at all. I mean, this is professional studios with years of experience and probably, thousands of resources available and brushes and photo packs, but also time associated with it. But nonetheless, it's really good to get an idea of just how much can be photoshopped into your render. The other thing too is that this workflow, the whole reason why we are going down this, let's call it matte painting workflow, is because it's relatively fast. Now, this type of render is not that fast. To get something this good will take a long time. And then again, the issue between renders like this, static matte painting renders, and say real-time rendering engines is real-time rendering engines, you just move your camera around and then you've immediately got a new render. If we wanted to take a render shot of this from a different angle, that means essentially starting all over again. However, it comes down to personal preference, but I tend to think that in terms of architectural visualization, these are so powerful because they're sort of suggestive, they're not prescriptive, and I think that's important. Real-time rendering engines have this sort of, I'm not sure how else to describe it, but it can be somewhere between either too cartoonish that it's unbelievable or so realistic that it becomes almost dictatorial. So I believe that that this sort of is a nice balance in between. But a good example of what I'm looking at here is sort of like even the foam white render itself. Look at how different that is. Even the shadows are darker, the whites are brighter. There's sort of more dirt that's put on this underside here. The glazing has all its reflections photoshopped in. There's no interior actually modeled here, but there is a, even actually as we scroll across, we can see some people in there and some lights inside the building, but none of that is actually within the actual render. It's all been photoshopped in. Obviously the water and the beach looks amazing, but you know, we'll get to that sort of idea of foreground and background modeling. But nonetheless, it shows you what potential does lay within Photoshop in this regard, and it is a very different method of using Photoshop than we have done previously with our floor plan. So let's move on now and open up our raw renders inside of Photoshop and get started on that. So I've begun with opening up the raw renders as we save them from Rhino, and I've got both the JPEG image and the PNG image. And the PNG image is going to be incredibly useful to Photoshop in all of the background. It's actually something that I didn't have or didn't do in this version. I actually went through and had to crop everything out with the glazing. So it goes to show that if you haven't got access to a PNG, it is still possible, but it's much more time consuming. So the PNG image is going to be very powerful because we can put things through the glazing and it essentially gives us the transparency through the glass. But I still have the the JPEG, because you never know when you need one over the other. So what I'll do first, I'm just going to drag one into the other and they should just line up. Yep, there we go. And I'll just drag that to the bottom. And I'm going to call them appropriately their correct names. So this is raw JPEG and raw PNG. I'll turn off the JPEG for now, and I'll close the JPEG image. Okay, so this is our rendered file. And of course, you should go and File, Save As, and you should keep these raw Photoshop renders, or you should keep the Photoshop file itself. So this is just the section. So I'll go assessment task 3 underscore interior render 1 section. Save that. Okay, cool. Next up, let's chuck in a white background just so we've got something to play with. So I'll just go with a white box, click and drag across the whole screen, and I'll put that at the very bottom. In fact, I'll put that just above the raw PNG. Okay, that's fine, and I can turn that off so I then can see the, or essentially no background. But what I wanted to do that for is because the next step is to crop this up. So just pressing C on the keyboard or going down to here in the toolbar to our crop tool. And you probably remember doing this with our Photoshop floor plan and ensuring that delete crop pixels is not ticked. If it's ticked, then we will not be able to recover these pixels. Now you might think, why would we want that to be the case? Once these are gone, they're gone. Again, it just comes back to that whole non-destructive editing workflow. We want to be very careful with that. So I'm going to drag this down and bring this just to below the ceiling line. I'll bring this back about sort of halfway down behind that wall leading to the laundry. So we don't now see any of the modeling that I didn't do in the laundry. And I'll drag this back a little bit further as well, because I got like some plant over here that I didn't remove. So I'll sort of bring that back like that. And then again, I'll bring this up here to be flush with the top of the slab. And I'm just going to zoom in. There we go. Okay, zoom out and then hit enter. All right, that's now done. And Control 1, so that's the real size of the image. Yep, looks good. Okay, not a bad start. And again, I can turn off that rectangle at the back, and now you can see what we have to play with. So next up, let's take a look at, let's paint in what we're trying to achieve here. So the way that I do that is I just make a new layer, and I'll just call this one composition, and I'm just going to take my brush tool, and we're going to go through shortly the brushes that I have versus yourself, but just take a hard brush, like a round hard brush or whatever you like. I generally will utilize a very harsh color, like a red or something like that, so it's very obvious what I am in art painting. And then it's time to work out what we want to do with this image. So this all comes down to composition and balance, and this is kind of hard to, there's no right or wrong here, as with everything with visualization and Photoshop, but it's what works for you. So immediately I can see it's quite heavy over this side of the image. There's quite a lot going on here, and it's quite empty over here. There's not a lot going on. So what I'll do, I'm just going to bring up the opacity, is with that in mind, what we need to do is we need to bring something over here. So it could be like a tree in the foreground, like so, or it could be multiple. It could be that the land sort of falls away back here to sort of offset what is happening on this side of the building. It could be that a person is sitting down here and another person is sitting here. Okay, you can see already that when I do that, it sort of brings everything in a little bit more. I'm just going to remove this part here. I'm being very rough, as you can tell. It's pretty hard to do with just a mouse as well. So it just has to sort of represent something to yourself. It does not have to be perfect. You could have another person that's sitting here even. Okay, that's not too bad. Or what you might want to do is perhaps we have like a pot plant or something in the corner here. Or you could have a couple of people talking. But I think really I'm going to end up with one person sort of standing around here and another person standing around here. And they could be moving, I'm not sure, but they're sort of chit-chatting over the top of the table. And then out the back here, again, we'll probably just have some sort of like landscape that's in the distance that's falling away, with some trees and whatnot back there. So something like that. So the point is that because the image is basically like the image is in thirds. So if I go to my crop, if I click on crop and then just click on the screen, you can see it's broken up into thirds. And this actually works quite well now, because you can see in this third on the right hand side, the people here and all of this makes this quite a full environment. But equally so with some trees at the back here, some people sitting down, maybe a pot plant there. There's actually quite a lot going on in this area that was previously quite empty. So that's how we know we're on the right track. So if I got rid of that, you can see again that sort of balance. Your eye wants to shift further to the right than to the left. But once we put the composition in, I think that's quite balanced now. Your eye is relatively even across the whole screen. It sort of makes you focus a little bit more on the interior, which, by the way, is good, because let's say, for instance, that my intention here is to sell how the interior and the exterior connect, or how nature and the internal architecture connect. We have basically like this open portal, which is this these sliding doors that are open, almost smack bang in the center of the render, which will be our direct portal or window into the environment. So that kind of works out in that regard. Okay, so again, there's no right or wrong here, but what it does do is it helps you target what you're going to do. So I know I have to find some people that work like this, maybe some people that sit down. I know I've got to get like a JPEG or a PNG of a big tree, and then some sort of landscape that's falling away, and then I know I'm good to go. I'm not going to be searching around for ages, just trying to establish what it is I'm after before I even start sticking in some external blocks. So that's inputting, that we've just to summarize, we've imported this image, we've put the JPEG and the raw PNG together, gave it a white background, cropped it down to what works for us, stuck in and painted in some composition. And then what we'll do now is we'll color correct the raw background before going out and finding some external references or some resources to bring into our render environment or our Photoshop environment. The color correction layers that we're going to add, or the adjustment layers we're going to add, will sit at the top of the stack and really refer to the raw render only, because our other blocks will sit above those adjustment layers. And then we'll have master adjustment layers over the entire stack once we're finished with that. So I'm just going to start with some really simple stuff. So firstly, I'm going to put hue saturation in here and just play around with that. You can see as I bring that up and down, we're changing how intense those colors are. We can change sort of the tinge of that, so it's pretty interesting. Making the browns browner, the greens greener. That's quite interesting. Actually, I really like that. The only thing I don't like is the chairs. So what I can do is I can mask that off. So I like that. I like what it's done to the onyx, to the couch, and to the timber, but I don't like what it's done to the chairs. It's made it a little bit too sort of chocolatey compared to the original. So because that's created a layer mask on that adjustment layer, I can then paint over that. So what I'll do is I'll take that, I'll click on the hue saturation layer, I'll click on the layer mask, and then I'm going to take a brush, and I'll take a soft brush. I'll turn down the opacity. Well, actually, I'll leave it at 100%. Doesn't really matter. And because it's on black paint, essentially it means it's going to be erasing. So if I just click here, it's erasing that color correction just around that area. And you can see that in the layer stack. You've got this little black dot there. That's an area where the hue saturation is no longer in effect on the raw render that sits underneath of it. All right, that looks good. We've covered that before inside of our assessment task too. I'll add another adjustment layer, and this time let's use levels, and I'll sort of bring up some of the lighter tones, but then darken off the darker tones. Yep, so that's before, that's after, a little bit more defined. And then let's go again, let's do color balance, and let's add in I think that's a bit better. Yep. Okay, off. So before and then after. So getting rid of a bit of the greens there and adding some more purples and reds into that. A little bit more burnt. All right, that looks good. So these are my color balances, all for the raw PNG or for the raw render. The other thing that does help too from time to time is if I just take this raw JPEG, I'm just going to shove that at the top and then turn that back on. So it gives you like this sort of overall sort of, that's where you started, that's where we currently are. That's where we started and that's where we currently are. So that's not too bad. I'm racing through these because if I was here doing the entire thing, it would be hours and hours. But I'm just going through, I guess, the rough workflow for each of these, and then I'm going to leave you to it to go through that process. You're going to have the holidays to do this, multiple weeks, and you probably want to do it over the course of time rather than one sitting. So you'll do it for, you'll do a block of work, then you'll go away and come back, and even when you're done, leave it, go away, and then come back, and you'll probably notice that your eyes will adjust, and there's certain things that you want to change or certain values that you want to change. Okay, so with that now done, let's take a look at some block resources online. So best thing to find is, there are a myriad of different websites. A really good example, here we go. So Architizer has a really good reference here. The Art of Rendering, 10 cutouts and texture resources for your architectural visualizations. You can just Google that and I'm sure you'll find it. There's a number of websites that are available. Immediate Entourage, GoBoTree, what else? Mr. Cutout. There's just heaps of them. The other one too, again, trusty old Archi 9 does have Photopacks that are available. So if you go Photopacks Archi 9 or photopacks.net, you'll see here they've got a bunch of them, including like high-res people. Some of them are as cheap as just $1 for them, and you'll get quite a lot of people there, so it'll save you a lot of time. And they're fully like cut out already, so you can just stick them in. Some of them even have shadows around like the bottom of their feet and stuff, so it works really well. That's one option. Viz people have amazing resources, but they are super expensive. Like you're talking £110, so what's that? Nearly $200 for a pack of people, and there's tons of them. So if I go like casual, there's multiple volumes of these. But one real good sort of trick that you can use, or one good reference you can use, is they're nice enough to give you an example or a sample in each of these. So if I click on the pack, you'll see there'll be a sample file, and the sample file is this one here. So you can download that sample file and save them off. And in fact, a lot of what I've got is that, like these samples, because if you do that for the 20 or so packs that are available, you have 20 or so free cutout people ready to use. So Viz people is another one. There's some other ones here that were referenced in that example. Immediate Entourage is another one. A lot of these you have to pay for. That's the only issue. Some of them allow free downloads, but most of them are paid for. Mr. Cutout's another example of there's some amazing ones in here where you can change sort of which space that they were in, whether they're standing, sitting, jogging, swimming, are they eating, what's the kind of light that they're in, what's the position of their face, their height, is it a person, single person, accessible, couples, families, people with dogs, and then gender as well, and then even ethnicity, and then also even where the camera was taken from. That is an incredibly good resource, but I can imagine that there's probably some cost to it, though I imagine there's probably some free ones in there as well, locked in. Ultimately, there is still nothing wrong with doing the original idea of just going to Google, going person standing, PNG, and then going through it that way. This will take a while to get a good library, but again, like with everything else, the first time you do it will be the longest, because next time you go to Photoshop for your next assignments, you're going to have a library of some pretty good people ready to go. So it's definitely worth your time investing into that. I have a selection of all of these previously. Either they're from firms that I've worked at where there's large libraries, or it's my own that I've invested in or come across, or just years of collating free images as well. So with that in mind, let's then go back into Photoshop where I have some references ready to go. So I'm just going to open that up. I'm going to go to today's class, resources, and I've got a bunch here. So let's start first of all with the background, because I think that's probably the most important one. So I've got two images of just open fields. They're just, one's just of a park and the other one is of like an open field. The open field one's probably the best one to start with, and I'm just going to click and drag straight into our render, and then I'm just going to drag that to being beneath the PNG image, and you can see how that's already like cut out for us. That is so much easier than what I was doing previously. Already you can see how much that adds to that image, and we haven't touched it yet. We just chucked the block straight in just as is. That's actually really good. That's already worked really well. The field, this one, I was going to use this one more for this area here. So what you can do is you can take these images and just drag a certain component of them. That works quite well. In fact, what I'm going to do is at the same time, I'll open up the other exterior shot. And this one's a little bit different because there's a lot in the foreground that we need to Photoshop here as well as the background. So if I took, again, this field and just drag that to the exterior and drag that behind, you'll see it does work in some instances because it's behind our building, but it doesn't actually work too well because it's the front of the building that we need to also Photoshop the foreground. So this is an instance where I'd be dragging this almost in front of our building like this, and I'm going to swap. I'm going to go Control T and then right click and then flip horizontal to get something that looks like this. The sky I don't really care about because we're going to sort of Photoshop the sky out and add our own in, but even there, what I'll do is I'll just sort of bring that down. I'll do something like that because the sky I can Photoshop in, so it's probably more of the fall of the land here. So I'll do something like that. And then what we can do is we'll use some masking tools, and it's pretty rough. So with the interior, with the internal shot, that's very easy because it's already sort of masked up for us. But with the exterior shot, there's a lot more work that needs to go on for vegetation. So with that now selected, I'll just call this one vegetation, and then I'm going to give that a mask. So I'll give that little Japanese flag. So I'm on a layer mask now. I'm going to go to a hard brush, okay, which is on black at 100%, and I'm just going to start sort of painting away, and you can see you can see very much how rough I'm being right there. Okay, and I'll even do the car back there, like that. And then what I'll do is I'll click back on the actual layer, turn up the opacity to 100, and then go back to the mask. And now it's a case of going through and switching back and forward between black and white to sort of bring the image back in. So a little tip for you is when you're in mask, a good shortcut to swap between black and white, which is essentially erase and return, is X. So when I press X on the keyboard, that goes back to being white. So now anywhere that I paint is going to bring the image back for me. And if I go too far, I could do something like that. I just hit X and then I can remove that again. So really the best way to start with this, I think, is I'm going to go X for white. I'm just going to click once, hold down Shift and click again. Hold down Shift, click again. Even here, click once, hold down Shift, click again. And I'm just sort of going around the border of my building as best I can. I can be again, because this is non-destructive, you can see I've sort of missed a few spots there. I can make that smaller. I can just keep working away until I get this exactly as I like. I'll switch that back to white. Okay, so that's one way of doing it. The other way of doing it is to use the lasso tool. So if I use my lasso, I'll click once there, to here. That's not perfect. I need to fix that end up. I'll do something like this. Okay, so I'm following the land, like so. I can just double click to close off that lasso. And then because that's sort of my selection, it's anything inside of that is now selected. It's actually the opposite. I want to inverse the selection. So I can go up to select and then click on inverse. So basically, instead of everything that's inside the lasso, it's everything outside the lasso that I can edit. Or the shortcut is Control-Shift-I, which has now done the same. So now I don't have to go around neatly and clean that up. On my white paint, I can just start painting away, and it's not going to affect anything within that lasso. But be careful, because I didn't lasso this side of the building, so you can see that it's cooked that up. So just keep that in mind. So I'll be a little bit more careful in the way that I'm doing that. Okay, so that's not too bad. That's a good start. It's we've got a lot more to go, but that works quite well for now. And that's how you get your foreground and background into an image. And you can see how quick that is and how this sort of falls with the land. So this image works quite well. But essentially that was just a case of going to Google image search and just typing in meadowy fields or vineyards or rolling hills, and then just searching for large images, and then just sort of bringing them in and using Control T, and then trying out, flipping it horizontally, using skew, distort, perspective, changing the size. There's no right or wrong here, just play around. And in particular, I care more about the foreground than I do about the sky, because the sky we can Photoshop in much more of that later on, whether it's much harder to Photoshop in, grass and foliage that suits the foreground image. Plus, we haven't even cropped this one yet. We still have a long way to go. So that's how we import our backgrounds in to begin with. So going back to our internal render, I'm going to go back to my resources and open up a few more. So go to resources, and I can start adding in people. So let's start with this guy, old mate here. I'll click on him. He's just a PNG that I can drag around. And this is a reference. This was a free reference from VizPeople, a free sample. So go back to my interior shot. And he is massive. So I'll drag him to be above everything, above my my corrections layer, and just zoom out, go Control T. And this is a big reason why people do pay for these resources too, because they're super high res. So this is a pretty small image we're doing. It's only a like a 980 by 1920 by 1080 render, but we're talking about renders that will go on the side of billboards and on trams and stuff, so they need to be big enough. Alright, so let's see. Okay, so he's probably the right size now. I'd say there. And I can sit him on the couch like so, but I don't like the way he's positioned. So I can just like right click, so I go Control T, right click, and then flip him horizontally so he's sort of facing inboard to the conversation. That's not too bad. That's a pretty good start. In fact, I think he might be just a smidgen bigger. Like so. Now I'm not too worried about the table here because we can brush that out shortly. But let's go back and see if we can find some more people. What's this one? Okay, so a lady reading. So I can just take her. You can see the shadow is separate. That's fine. I'll just take her and sit her also on the couch. This will probably be the component that takes the longest, is just finding people that suit your scene. Both suit your scene in terms of position and size and whatnot, but also context. Like you can see I'm choosing people that are casual in nature. They're not like office workers, as an example. Alright, I think that he is probably too big. That's pretty good now. That works. And if I turn on my composition, we're not far off how we wanted to compose this. Okay. Now I haven't color corrected them or anything. I'm just dragging them in at the moment, but I will create a layer for them. So we'll go people, and I'll take that is the gentleman sitting down. So man sitting, and character female sitting. I'll take her and chuck her in the group, and also him, put him in the group. Okay, so I can turn both of them off at once. Again, just general general Photoshop file hygiene, very important. I'll keep those two, but I'll get rid of the two people. And I'll take, let's see, I thought I had more people standing. I might have to go back to my library. So in my library, you can see I have people, and then like I've broken up animals, children, couples moving, groups standing still, people, individual moving, and standing men, standing women. It's not that big of a library, but it does, for the most part, what I need it to do. Let's just see what ones these are. Okay, so none of those actually work. He could work. Obviously not an umbrella. And then let's go back and just go standing woman. Is there one that suits? Okay, so that one, no. That one could work. That one, no. So I'll take that. Interior. And I'll flip him around, flip vertical, so he's behind a counter. He'll probably be taller, and so will she actually. Maybe just a smidgen shorter. Okay, so something like that. And they're all sort of, definitely in the wrong position. But what we do now is we go through and then clean them up with the mask. So let's start with this guy that's standing here. I'll go to his layer, and then I'll use a lasso. And again, I'll be very rough with the lasso. Be something like that, and then double click, and then go to put a mask on that layer. Okay, whoops, wrong way. I need to Control Shift I and then click on mask, and that removes everything that's in that area. But we can still get it back later on, which helps. So those two now, that looks much better. We haven't started color correcting them yet, and I should name them correctly. So this is man standing, and this is female standing. All right. She's fine, and then both of the ladies sitting and the lady sitting down, she's fine, and this gentleman here, I'll go man sitting, and then I'll do the same thing again. So I'll go around my coffee table just roughly. So I've got a book on the table here, does something like this, and I think it will come down like this. Double click, Control Shift I to inverse the selection, and then click on the little flag. There we go. Now he's behind the coffee table. So it looks pretty good. And again, let's just take a look at where we started. So that's what we started with, and that's where we're at now. Already quite a lot. Now, next thing is probably we should color correct these people. And really, the biggest thing to do is to bring down the saturation. So with that entire people's group selected, I'm going to go for an adjustment layer. And I'm going to go hue saturation, hold down, it will be on the entire group. So I want it to be up here, and then hold down Alt. So it just applies to the people group. And let's just double check. If I get rid of all the saturation, you can see that just the people are black and white now. So that's good. So I'm going to bring down the saturation quite a lot. Okay. Now I can do this for individuals as well, like per person. And in some instances that may be okay. And in which case you might want to be just a little bit more destructive with your editing too, just to save time. So even though I've got that hue saturation over the entire people's group, I can even just right click on the female standing. There she is there. And then go to image. I have to go into her group because she's made up of multiple layers. Go image, adjustments, and then change just her. So hue saturation, I'll bring some more saturation out so that that skirt isn't as red, but I'm just adjusting her now and no one else. But that's just, really is just up to you. The other thing I can do is I can dodge and burn these people individually as well. So let's take, for instance, take this lady over here. If I right click, go female sitting, I can then go to my dodge and burn tool. So I'm on the dodge, so let's burn, and I'll just click on her, and I'm darkening her up specifically, probably somewhere around her back, because there'll be a bit of shadow, contact shadow from where she's sitting on the couch. Now, it doesn't look like much at the moment, but when I zoom out, it just sort of sits a little bit better. It's just little things like that that really help your characters sit in the scene. The other one too that I find works quite well is, some people like static images. I personally really like blurring them. And, a good way to do that is I can take both the guy that's standing, and I can give him a motion blur. So I can go blur, motion blur, and then I can get an example. Whoops, it would help if I was doing that right. So I'll make sure I go into the group and I select him himself. Filter, blur, motion blur, and you can see how he's blurred now. And I can just change the pixels of how blurred I want, whether it's something like that or I want it so blurred that you can't even see where he is anymore. I tend to do something like that, which is actually pretty exaggerated, even though he's kind of sitting still. but it does give the appearance that there's motion in play now. So I'll go OK, and I'll close off his group, and then I'll open her group, click on her image, and then do the same thing. Filter, motion blur, does the same thing. I might bring hers back just slightly. So it's like that. That's just an example of what you can do. Particularly in the exterior shots, this works really well. Next up, I'm going to go to, so I'm going to close off my people. I'm going to right click and give that a color. Okay, and then my background is here. So I'll call this background, and I'm going to make that a group. Background. Okay, take that background image, and we can also give that a hue saturation. So I can go image, adjustments, hue saturation, and then change that. Now this is destructive. I'm doing this permanently because it's not a adjustment layer. 6 of one, half dozen the other. You can do whatever you like, but I'm just doing this on the fly because I know that this is what I personally like. Okay, so it looks good. Image, adjustments, and this time color balance, add more red. That's better. And the sky is nowhere near as blue as what it was before. Sitting much, much better in this space. Okay, so that looks good. Okay. Now, we don't really need to add any sky or anything like that here. But what we can do is we are going to add in a tree behind. So go to here, vegetation, PNG image. I could take a... That's probably a good one there. Alright, so I'll take this one, open that up, that's it there. Click and drag that into my render, and you can see it's sitting behind, but it needs to sit on top of my background image, which it is. Okay, I go to that tree, Control T. Okay, I'll do something like that. Alright, and then I can use hue saturation and color balance to change that up relevant to the rest of my imagery. But this is kind of correct already because images in the foreground are going to be more vibrant and they're going to be sharper than in the background. As things draw off into the distance, they become more foggy, more misty. The contrast gets less, the difference between light and dark becomes less because of the horizon, the atmosphere, and also the definition is less as well. But what I do want to do with that tree at least is give it a little bit more of a reddish color. So adjustment layer, color balance, and I'll sort of redden that tree up a little bit and purple. So it's not as like green. So you can see before and then after. So it's a little bit more sort of natural. Okay, not too bad. Okay, so what we'll do next is, so we've gone through quite a lot there. I've added people, we've edited the people, masked them up, added backgrounds, added vegetation, using color corrections, and then also applying some layer effects like blur. Next up, what we'll do is we'll do some painting. We'll paint in some vegetation, we'll paint in some grass and whatnot. And so to do that, we first of all need to find brush packs to download. To add new brush packs, we open up our brush palette down here on the right hand side, which I have open, and I click on these little 3-line bar here. When I click on that, it will allow me, it might be hard to see on the screen, it might have been cropped, but there's a little button there that just says import brushes, where you then just navigate to a brush set that you want to import, click load, and you're good to go. So in my case, there are many good brushes that are available to download. In fact, there are probably countless thousands of different sets to download. However, again, good old Archie 9, they've got a great set of brushes that you can download for free, literally for nothing. I think you just have to follow follow the prompts there, add it to cart, but then just say that you're going to pay $0 for it, and then you can download it. So there's 58 custom brushes in there, and there's even a tutorial here showing you how to use those brushes appropriately, and it's very powerful what you can do with their set of brushes. So again, just follow the prompts. So just go Google Archie 9 brush set, and I'm sure Google's first result will be this page. Beneath that, you can see some examples of some of the sets that are in there, and we'll go through it briefly as well, but includes stuff like foliage, like trees and leaves and clouds and stuff like that. And that's where a lot of the power really comes in. So going back to Photoshop, let's take a look at perhaps our exterior shot. We'll come back to that, and we'll talk specifically about the sky and how we can use these brushes there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up another resource. I'm going to go today's class. Okay, I'm going to pick this sky, which is overly blue, and just drag this into the image and put it at the back. Actually, you know what? I'm not even going to do that. What I am going to do is I'm going to take this vegetation image, and I'm going to just select, use the marquee tool, take that, and I'm just going to drag that up. Or what I'll do, actually, so Control T, and I'll just drag it like this. Okay, Control D to deselect. So now it's pretty distorted, but that's fine. So what we can do now is I'm going to add another layer. I'm going to call this one clouds, and I'm going to take a brush. Okay, and then in my brush palette down here, I can scroll through all these Archie 9 brushes, and you can see there's a couple of different clouds. So clouds 1, 2, 3, and 4. So let's take perhaps clouds 4 as an example, and you'll see, so if I make this red, wherever I click, it sort of randomizes it for me, but it comes up with random clouds. So what I can do is I'm going to pick the color of these clouds. I'm going to hold down Alt to get my eyedropper tool. So I'll grab this sort of grayish blue, make it smaller, change the opacity down to say maybe 60%, and start just sort of clipping away. Then sample another color, take a really bright one, and you can see how this is working. We can essentially mesh out any of those distorted clouds. We can even add some more blue into the sky too if we wish. Okay, and then I can change my clouds, so maybe clouds 2, again eyedropper, and then just click a couple here and there. The other thing I can do as well is, if I go clouds 3, I'm going to take like a bluish sort of white color and make that much smaller, and I'm just going to go across. See how as I go across the trees, it looks like it's like almost foggy now across the top of the trees. I'm adding in like atmosphere. Okay, like so. It's not bad, it's okay. But what I can do is I'll go to another clouds 1, and I'll use a masking tool. So I'll mask that clouds layer, and now with my black paint, I can then essentially subtract, but subtract in like the shape of a cloud. So I'm just sort of running this back the other way now. I'll turn down the opacity a bit more, just so it sort of blends a little bit better with the backdrop. That's better, much better. Okay, something like that. That's pretty cool. So before and after, if I turn off the clouds, that's what it looks like. Turn it on, that's what it looks like. So just those cloud brushes, very, very useful. Okay, so that's our sky. And I'd be doing the same with our internal render. I'd be cleaning up these clouds a little bit more, maybe adding some more atmosphere to these trees out here, because they shouldn't be so sharp. They should be a little bit more desaturated and less defined. So with the exterior shot, let's play around with some of these brushes a bit more. Now, granted, I haven't finished even masking this up yet, but what I can do is let's add another layer, and we'll just call this one grass. And I'm going to come down here and let's find some other materials, some other paints. So you can see there's like foliage, there's leaves, there's all sorts of stuff, but then these blades of grass are very good. So let's take, for instance, this one here, number 127. I'll click on that. And again, if I use like a very bright color just to give you an idea, I'll use red and I'll turn the opacity all the way up. And it's on its own grass layer. You can see that as I paint, oh, it should have been red, but anyway, it just sort of randomizes it. I just click and I can drag, or I can just keep clicking and it sort of randomizes it for me, something like that. Now, what can we do with that? How can we make this work? Well, again, I'll delete that, go back to my brush. The key here is to change the size and to change the color often. So I'll stick with it at 100% opacity, because then what we'll do is we'll make the layer itself less opaque, a little bit more, give it some transparency. But the colors and the randomization is really from me going here and sampling a color, making a size choice and going, okay, I want it to be something like this, and then clicking another one, making it a bit smaller, and then working my way through there. And particularly where this is useful is not so much in the foreground like this, but really in the background where it meets the building. So take over here where I want to clean this up, and I want to clean this up over here. I can hold down my eyedropper tool, select that, make this much smaller, and then randomize this along the front of the building. You can see how that's working now. I can grab another color, so let's say like this yellowy sort of color, and then go again. And I'm just clicking randomly here and there. So it brings away that sharpness that was there from when we did our masking around the outside of the building. And it's very sort of, you have to sort of finesse it, but it does work. And you can see now that even from here, these areas are looking a lot better blended between the foreground and your building. You can do the same thing the other way. So I can take this and let's take maybe something like this, these sorts of grass blades. And I'll use a lighter color. And I'll just sort of stream them. Where we got something much brighter, like that. I'll just stream them through like that. Or you can do the opposite. So if I make it dark and make it black, I can sort of run them through here. And at the moment that does look a little bit strange, but you'll see once we change that up, I'll use some other type of grass blades. Something like that. And then we go to our master layer, or the grass layer, and then I'll draw that opacity down. You'll see what happens now is this area just sort of becomes darker. It doesn't become defined, but when I turn that off, you can see it really sort of frames the image, having this sort of vignette around the outside of the render. So when I turn it on and off, you can really see that difference. And that's a key component here, is that the real effect will be when you turn it off and back on. So you take like the clouds in the sky, or again, even just take the raw render, take the original render, stick it at the top, and turn everything else off. That's what you started with, and that's what you've got now. And that's really only 3 items we've added to this external render: a background, foreground, a sky, and then painted in some clouds, and then painted in some blades of grass. So there's some examples of what we can do with the Archi9 brush pack with just clouds and with blades of grass. And you'll see there's all sorts of other stuff here like foliage, trees, and whatnot. The other one that's really powerful is birds. So if I take like these birds here, I'll use like a white color, and I'll make a new layer, and I can just change the size of them. And I can just sort of draw them in, and I might change them. So I use this bird type now, and I can just click them randomly. You can see how those birds are appearing, and they even change in size. I'm not doing anything, it just randomizes it for me, and that gives a really cool effect without too much information. Alright, now back to our internal shot, and let's look at some other typical brushing or painting that we can do. So I'm going to utilize, in this instance, just soft brushes. Nothing else here is really required. What we can do is, what we're really looking for is, I'm going to make another layer at the top of the stack. Okay, and I'm going to make a new group and call this master brushes. And then here, I'll call this one to begin with light, and then just start painting away. So with a white paint, it's at 100% opacity, and that's fine. So where do I want light to be coming from? Probably from, not so much from there, but maybe sort of over here a little bit more. Okay, so do something like that. Comes in like so. That's quite overburnt, and it's quite overbearing, or it appears that way. But straight away I take the opacity, drop that right back down to say like 20%, and then let's go again. And this time I might do something similar. Behind the kitchen cabinet, sort of like that. So it's sort of lightening up this area. Okay, and another one. And this time I'll do the opposite, I'll do shadows. So with a black paint on another layer, I'm just sort of running across like that. Probably in front of them, like that. Around here, around the back of the table and chairs. And then again, turn down that opacity. Right down. So again, raw render at the top of the stack, that's what we started with. That's where we're at. And there's probably that light layer is probably still too bright, so I'll bring that down a little bit. Okay. And then what we can do as well is we can add in some mist. So I'll go for another brush, but this time I'll use a color that I like. I really like the purples and the magentas. So I'll take something like that and I'll make it much brighter, like a really bright pink. And because this lamp is meant to be that sort of color, I can just sort of run my brush around it. And then even more broadly, I can turn down the opacity slightly. Just do something like that. Okay, and then turn down the opacity massively for that layer. Okay, so it doesn't look like much, but again, turn it off and you'll notice the difference, particularly around here in the trees over there. Okay. Okay, alright. Now, close that off. Now, finally, adding in some reflections in the grass. This is quite easy. So I still have this park image over here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my exterior shot, and I'm just going to do this quickly. I'm going to make some selections. So with my lasso tool, I'm just clicking and I'm selecting around the glazing, holding down shift to create another lasso. Okay, holding down shift. So I'm creating multiple lassos that depict just the glazing zone of the windows. And if you stuff that up, just go Control Z to bring back, whoops, hold down shift to start another lasso. But if you mess it up, just go Control Z and that will bring it back. Okay, so something like that, and then I'll even do it over here. So around these windows, and I'll be a little bit more messy. I'll just sort of go across the entirety of the glazing, and again over here. Okay, so I have something that looks like this. Okay, whoops, I lost those now. That's a bit annoying, but that's okay. I'll do these two. Make sure you hold down shift so you do start a new lasso, like I keep forgetting to do. Hold down shift, new lasso. You only have to hold down shift once to start a new one. So these two are there. Hold down shift to create a new one, and then just click away. I'm being pretty messy here, but it will do the job. You'll take your time with it. Okay, so I have something like that. So I've got 4 window areas sort of selected. I'm going to go up to select, and then I'm going to save selection. There we are, save selection, and I can choose a name for it. So I can say in this instance glazing, go OK. So even if I get rid of that selection, I don't have to do that lasso again. I can go up to select, load selection, and then just click on the one that I want, which is already there, channel is glazing, and then say OK, and then that lasso comes back. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to grab this image. So I'll get rid of that. Grab this image, just drag it straight into our exterior shot. And this is the same with the glazing on the interior as well. No different. Exactly the same. So it comes in like that. Okay, so I'll do something like that. And then I'll grab my selection, load selection, change it to my glazing, say OK, then inverse it, so Control Shift I, and then click the masking tool. Wrong one, sorry, I didn't have to go Control Shift I. I can just go load my selection and then go mask. Okay, and now it's done exactly that. It's cropped out that image just around this area. Now it doesn't have to be perfect, but as long as there's some sort of color and some sort of vegetation in there, that gives a good effect. And then it's as simple as just turning down that opacity. And you can see now that gives a really good effect that these windows are reflecting the environment around it, even here and over here. You can see the difference if I turn that off. Turn it off, that's how it looks. Turn it back on, that's how it looks. Now, I would do the same thing on the internal of this glazing as well. So I'd go through and create my selections, and I'd bring an image in like that, just so we can get some reflectivity on the interior of the glass as well. It'll really bring the image to life. The final thing to do now is maybe to add some lights or some light flares. So you can essentially you can just go to Google and type in light flare PNG, and you'll find something. I generally just have two types of light flares, and they've always worked for me. So I'll go blocks, miscellaneous. Okay, I have these lens flares or light flares. I'm going to go for this one here, and I'll just click OK. Okay, and then I'll drag that straight into my image, my interior render, and it looks like this. But what I'll do, I'll put it above the stack for starters. Change the layer style to overlay. Sorry, it is. There we go, lighten. So I change it to lighten, and you can see wherever I move this now, I get like that light flare. I think even screen works well. In fact, screen works much better. Okay, so then it's a case of just taking this image, scaling it down, and then just sticking it somewhere close to a light. And then I can just select it like you did like with anything else. So marquee, hold down Alt, and I can just copy that. Okay. Because it's on screen, you have to be a little bit careful because it's going to sort of cut out everything else. So the other way to do that, what I can do is actually just go through that layer itself and copy the entirety of the layer. So what I'll do is I'll go back to here, go Control D, and the actual layer itself I'll just copy in its entirety. Okay, it needs to be cleaned up a little bit, but it gives you a bit of an idea of how that lens flare looks. And then I'd go through again with a masking layer and just sort of clean that up a little bit so they look different to each other. So not every single light is the same. That's only if you want that effect, but it does give that idea that light is on. And because we've lightened up the back of this cabinetry as well, it gives the appearance that the light is shining on that surface. But I think what would really finish this off would be some vegetation over here, perhaps some light flares, and then also adding reflections on the inside of the glass would go a long way. And then finally just sort of going through and adding a few more adjustment layers again. So I go, say for instance, even just brightness and contrast, bring up the brightness of the entirety of this render. Hue saturation, take out some of the saturation in general, just a smidgen. Color balance, add a little bit more reds. That could be it. And then if I show the original, so again, that's the original render we started with, and that's the end. So it's a big difference in really just, really about half an hour's worth of work, but you guys will have multiple weeks to complete this component. So I expect you'll end up with a really good result at the end of that. So between those two renders, the exterior and the interior, I went through slightly different workflows for items that are needed, but the rest of it is very similar. Putting people in, lighting, shadows, painting, brushing in other items, it's all very similar. The window reflections, and again, the external shot's actually much easier because you're much further away from the building, so there's less care that needs to be taken there. It's just really about blending in your environment to the building. The last thing I will say is that in terms of adding people in the external shot, that's quite easy. So I come to here, resources, and I've got a kid a child that's playing with a kite, so I can bring that in. And so I'll just take the kid himself, so there he is, and I'll bring him over the exterior shot. Okay. Place him there. And then what I can do is using a mask, I can put a mask over him, but then using the brushes, but particularly like the grass brushes, I can then remove parts of him so it looks like he's standing in the grass. So I'll take those blades, got my black paint, 25% opacity, that looks good. And I can just sort of work around the feet of the kid. I'll turn up the opacity a little bit for this bit. So you can see it looks like now he's behind the grass. I'll make this a bit bigger. Like so. And now it looks like he's actually in the field itself. And then to really sort of clean it up, I reckon in a way, you want a splash of color, but you don't want a definition of color for this. So this in particular is where a motion blur applied to the kid works really well, and quite an aggressive one. Like so, I reckon. That works really well. And then you can add your hue saturation if you want to change that up a little bit. And that same principle can be applied to, say, like a dog that's running as well. So here, in terms of the color range, I'm just going to use a color range, select all the white. Delete that. Bring the dog now into that render. And do the exact same thing. So once I add the motion blur to the dog, a lot of these issues will sort of disappear. So I'll take the dog's sort of running over here. Same deal. I'll give it a mask. Make it look like the dog's in the field. And then go back to the actual layer and give the dog the same sort of motion blur. Okay, and it works like that. That's probably a little bit too much. So I'll go to blur, blur, and then motion blur. Bring that back a little. There we are. And go OK, and then I reckon we're good to go. So there's still a lot more to do in this render, but we're pretty close with quite limited tools. So with this Photoshop tutorial, it's pretty in depth, and there's a lot of different workflows that we've covered in summation. But ultimately, it's really for you to take these different tools and techniques and apply them to your renders. The final component, which we'll cover in the next class, will be essentially taking these items and then assigning them to the title block, and then that is your assessment task 3 completed.